There was never a single moment when Morty realized something was wrong. It was more like the way dust settles, slowly, invisibly, until one day you notice the shapes it's made. His earliest memories had no clean borders. A birthday cake missing its candles, a family trip where the car radio played nothing but silence, a school picture where he could see his classmates' smiles but not his own face among them. Sometimes his toys would vanish. Not in the way toys usually do, buried under a bed, left behind at a friend's house, but in a way that felt like they had never been invented at all. Once, he reached for his favourite wind-up frog and found only an empty spot on the shelf. His mother, folding laundry nearby, frowned and said, "What frog?" in the same tone you'd use to correct a dream. At first, he tried not to care. Kids are good at making do with whatever's left. He'd invent games that didn't need pieces, stories that didn't need characters. He played alone more often, but he told himself that was fine. The other children seemed friendly enough, even if they sometimes forgot his name halfway through a conversation. There were stranger moments too, ones he learned not to mention. A soccer ball would roll toward him across the grass, and he'd be ready to kick it, only for the ball to blink out of existence mid-bounce. Or he'd look up from his cereal to see his father frozen mid-sentence, blinking at him like someone waking from a nap they didn't remember taking. It wasn't frightening exactly, more like standing in shallow water while the tide slowly pulls away, leaving your toes uncovered. He could still see the people he loved. He could still hear their voices. But there was always this space, a gap. Some nights, lying in bed, Morty would try to remember the whole shape of a day. What had he eaten for lunch? Who had sat next to him on the bus? It was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The harder he tried, the more it slipped away. And yet, there was a strange comfort in the forgetting. He couldn't have explained why, but part of him felt lighter each time a memory dissolved. The world carried on without noticing. His mother tucked him in with the same gentle pat on the blanket. His father still reminded him to brush his teeth. Summer still rolled her eyes at his jokes. And yet, some evenings, he'd hear them in the kitchen talking about someone, that felt just out of reach, like a name you almost remember in a dream. By the time Morty was 9, he had learned not to expect the edges of his life to stay fixed. The borders shifted like clouds. The people and places were there, and then they weren't, and then they were again in some slightly different way. And if he felt lonely, he learned to carry it quietly, like a stone in his pocket. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of training, for the day the universe itself would start to forget him on purpose. But that part of the story hadn't come yet. For now, he was just a boy who was always slightly less there than everyone else, and nobody, not even him, could say why. It happened on a Tuesday evening, though the sky looked like Sunday twilight, that kind of muted gold that makes you walk slower without realizing it. Morty had stayed late after school, wandering without purpose, until his feet led him to the old planetarium at the far edge of town. It hadn't been open in years. The paint peeled at the corners, the ticket booth sat empty, and the glass doors were clouded with dust. Something about it drew him in, as though he'd been here before in a half-remembered dream. The main entrance was locked, but a side door hung loose, and when he pushed it open, the air smelled of old paper and rain. Inside, the darkness was warm. Rows of empty seats curved toward the great domed ceiling, which once had shown the stars. Now it was bare and pale, except for a single patch of faint light, not electric, but something softer, like moonlight trapped indoors. She was standing there, in the middle of the room, tall, still, and shimmering faintly, as though made from the night sky itself. Her hair moved like strands of comet tail. Her eyes held the weight of entire constellations. She carried no bag, no books. But when she spoke, her voice sounded like it had been written down long ago. "I collect what people leave behind," she said. Morty didn't answer right away. He felt small, like he'd stepped into a story that had been waiting for him. Like lost things. She tilted her head. "Not quite. I keep the moments people forget. The seconds, the hours, the days that slip through the cracks. They're still out there, but no one remembers them, so I give them a place to rest." It was then he noticed the shelves. They stretched along the walls, filled not with books but with jars, each holding something faintly glowing, sometimes bright as candlelight, sometimes no more than a spark. A few pulsed softly as though breathing. She walked over to one and lifted it toward him. Inside he saw a snow-covered street and 2 children building a lopsided snowman. He didn't recognize them, but something about the moment, the way one child's scarf trailed in the wind, made his chest ache. "You have more of these than anyone I've ever met," she said quietly. "Your life is porous. Things slip away from you more easily. The world forgets you faster than it should." Morty didn't know what to say. He thought about the wind-up frog, the disappearing soccer ball, the friends who paused mid-sentence. "Why?" "That," she said, with the faintest smile, "is not mine to answer." She placed the jar back on the shelf and stepped closer. Her presence was warm, but not heavy, like standing in a patch of sunlight on a winter day. When the forgetting grows stronger, you may feel the pull to let go entirely. If that day comes, you'll have a choice to make. Until then. She reached into her pocket and placed something small in his palm, a silver key, cold and delicate, for the door between the worlds that remember and the worlds that do not. Before he could ask her what she meant, the light in the room dimmed, the shelves blurred, and when he blinked he was standing outside the planetarium again, the side door shut tight behind him. The silver key remained in his hand, and the sky was darker now, scattered with stars. He walked home slowly, the key pressing against his palm, wondering if it was possible to miss someone you'd only just met. It began so quietly that Morty almost convinced himself it was nothing. A Tuesday morning, rain streaking the bus windows, his forehead resting against the cool glass. He was watching the trees pass when he realized his reflection wasn't there. The glass showed the wet streets, the passing fences, the blurred shapes of other kids, but not him. When he leaned closer, the space where his head should have been was filled with the rain-smeared outline of the world behind him. He lifted a hand. Nothing in the glass moved. By the time he stepped off the bus, the reflection had returned, as if it had only wandered away for a while. It happened again in the school hallway, in a different way. He called out to a friend, not a close one, just someone he sometimes sat with at lunch. But the boy walked right past him without so much as a glance. Morty thought maybe he hadn't heard, so he called again, louder. This time the boy paused, looked around with a puzzled frown, then shrugged and kept walking. It wasn't anger Morty felt, or even sadness. It was more like the feeling of watching an ice cube melt, slow, irreversible, oddly beautiful in a way you can't explain. That afternoon in science class, the teacher asked for volunteers to hand out worksheets. Morty raised his hand, certain he had. The teacher's gaze swept the room as though skipping over an empty chair where he sat. She called on someone else. He didn't say anything. He just kept quiet, tracing the edge of his desk with his fingertip, and tried to remember the way the star librarian's eyes had looked, heavy with knowing, but gentle too. Later, walking home, he noticed his shadow had gone missing. The late sun stretched the shapes of trees, parked cars, and the power lines across the pavement. But the place where his shadow should have been was bare. His steps felt lighter without it, as though he weighed less. When he got home, his mother smiled from the kitchen, asked about his day, and set a plate in front of him. No sign that she'd noticed anything unusual. Maybe she couldn't see the missing pieces. Maybe no one could. That night, Morty lay awake listening to the house breathe, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the floorboards, and he felt the faintest tug in his chest. Not fear, not loss. More, like an invitation. He thought of the silver key, still hidden in his desk drawer, and wondered what kind of door it might open when the time came. Rick was not a man who missed much. He liked people to believe he wasn't paying attention, that he was too drunk, too bored, too tangled in the machinery of his own genius to care about little things. But the truth was, Rick Sanchez noticed everything, and lately he'd been noticing Morty in a way he didn't want to. It started with the pauses. They'd be in the garage, Morty holding a wrench or passing him a tool, and Rick would glance up only to find Morty, blurred somehow. Not visually, not exactly, but in the way you forget a word while it's still in your mouth. Like Morty was there 1 second, and the next, his presence had to be remembered in order to feel real again. One morning, Rick was explaining the dimensional stabilizer to him, a rare moment when he was actually in the mood to teach, and halfway through the sentence he realized he'd been talking to empty space. He blinked, frowned, then looked again, and there was Morty, standing exactly where he'd been, eyes glazed as though he'd been away. You hear any of that?" Rick asked, voice sharper than he meant. Morty hesitated. "Some of it." "Uh-huh." Rick turned back to his workbench, jaw tight, pretending it didn't matter. That night, Rick sat in the garage long after everyone else had gone to bed. He fiddled with scrap metal and wiring, but his mind kept looping back to a single image. Morty without a shadow, Morty without an echo, Morty slipping through a space in the world that no one else could see. He started building something, not because Morty had asked, not because he planned to use it, but because it was easier than sitting still with the thought that Morty might one day simply not be there. Rick didn't tell anyone, not Morty, not Summer, not even himself in the way that counted. He worked in silence, humming under his breath, the sound rough and uneven, and when the hum stopped, there was only the faint clink of tools and the unspoken truth hovering between them. Rick Sanchez had seen the signs, and he didn't like where they were leading. It was never a conscious decision. Morty didn't wake up one morning and think, "I'm going to find the places that don't remember me." It was more like the way a river finds the lowest part of the land, a quiet, inevitable pull. It began with a convenience store on the corner of 3rd and Maple. Morty had been there hundreds of times, usually to buy the same soda, but one afternoon the clerk looked at him like a stranger. No flicker of recognition, no, "Hey kid," like usual. She rang up his drink, handed him the change, and her eyes were as blank as the receipt paper. After that, he started noticing more places like it. A little bookstore 2 towns over, where the shopkeeper never asked if he needed help, never even seemed to notice when he left without buying anything. A dim laundromat where the machines hummed like they were breathing, and no one looked up when he walked in. The oddest was the train. He'd found it by accident, wandering after sunset. The platform was nearly empty, the air cool and metallic, and the train had no sign above it. Inside, the seats were worn but clean, the windows fogged just enough to blur the passing world. The conductor never asked for a ticket. No one spoke. People boarded and left without a glance toward each other. It was a place between places, and it seemed perfectly content not to know who he was. One evening, Morty took out a notebook and began drawing a map. It wasn't neat, and it wasn't to scale. He marked each spot with a small star and a note. Bookstore where they don't see you. Train with no destination. Market of gestures. The market was his favourite. Hidden behind an alley in a part of the city he didn't recognise, it stretched in a curve of lantern-lit stalls. Every vendor spoke without words, a wave of the hand for welcome, a tilt of the head for thank you. Morty wandered for an hour, tasting things that dissolved on his tongue like clouds, holding objects he couldn't remember the moment he put them down. No one asked his name. No one asked anything at all. He realized with a kind of quiet surprise that he didn't feel lonely in these places. If anything, he felt more himself, or maybe less in a way that was comfortable. The edges of him loosened, and the pressure of being remembered lifted. By the time he got home, his map had grown. The lines between the stars twisted and looped, connecting places like threads in a net. He didn't know what he was catching. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything that mattered. The first dream was simple. Summer was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the window in a way it rarely did in real life. Morty sat across from her, eating toast. He wasn't saying much, just smiling faintly, tapping the crumbs into a neat little pile. When she looked down for her coffee and then back up, he was gone. She woke up feeling oddly peaceful, though she couldn't remember why. The second dream was stranger. They were walking along the edge of a frozen lake, bundled in coats that didn't belong to them. Morty kept pointing out shapes in the ice, a bird here, a ladder there, a doorway half buried in snow. She laughed, but each time she turned to look at the shapes, they were gone, and Morty was a few steps farther away. When she called his name, he just waved, like it was fine. By the third dream, Summer had started writing them down. She didn't know why. Most mornings she forgot them almost immediately, but the act of scribbling a few words in her notebook made her feel anchored. The dreams weren't vivid in the usual way. They didn't cling like nightmares or leave the shock of sudden joy. Instead, they felt like visiting. An old song you used to love, one you'd forgotten existed until the first note played. One night she dreamed they were in the garage, except the walls were lined with shelves of glowing jars, like fireflies caught mid-breath. Morty was holding one, his face lit from below. "This is the day I almost disappeared," he said, not sadly, just stating it like a fact. When she woke, she felt the pull of that sentence in her chest. She didn't tell anyone. She just took a pen and wrote Morty across the inside of her wrist. The ink smudged by lunch, but she rewrote it every morning without knowing why. By the end of the week, Summer had started to notice small gaps in her memory when it came to her brother, like not remembering what shirt he'd worn to dinner, or whether he'd even been at dinner at all. But in her dreams, he was always there, clearer than he was in waking life. Some part of her, even if she couldn't have explained it, knew this was important, knew that the dreams were holding on to something the day could not. He found it one evening when the sky felt wider than usual. Rick had left him at a transit hub between dimensions. 2 hours, Morty. Don't get lost. And wandered off to barter for something loud and illegal. Morty wandered too, following the hum of unseen engines, until the hallways grew quieter and the walls turned to stone. There was no door, only a narrow archway draped in vines that shimmered faintly, as though each leaf remembered a different kind of sunlight. Morty stepped through, and the air changed. The garden wasn't large, but it felt endless in the way some dreams do. Paths of pale sand wound between beds of flowers, each unlike any he'd seen before. Some glowed from within, some swayed without wind. A few had petals that seemed to whisper when you leaned too close. It took him a while to notice that the flowers weren't arranged by colour or size, but by something else. Moments. He could feel it when he passed them. Each plant was a lost day, a forgotten hour, a timeline that had unravelled and drifted here instead of disappearing entirely. Near the centre stood a tree with silver bark and leaves that looked like pressed photographs. He touched one and saw a flicker of a life that wasn't his. A woman making soup in a kitchen that never existed. A child laughing in a park no one had built. The images faded as quickly as they came. A small figure appeared at his side, not the star librarian, but a gardener dressed in clothes the colour of dusk. Their hands were soil-stained, their eyes bright. "You can tend to them if you like," they said, as though they'd been expecting him. Morty knelt beside a cluster of soft blue flowers, each one no bigger than a coin. When he brushed the petals, a warmth rose through him, a memory of something he might have lived or maybe only wished for, sitting on a porch with someone he cared about, the sound of rain on the roof. He stayed there, for a long time, gently clearing fallen leaves, straightening stems that had bent toward the sand. The work felt unhurried, patient. Nothing here demanded to be remembered, but nothing resented being forgotten either. When he finally left, the gardener pressed a single seed into his palm. "In case you ever need to grow your own place to rest," they said. Morty didn't know if it would grow in his world, but he kept it anyway, tucked beside the silver key in his pocket. 2 things now, both meant for doors he hadn't yet opened. The citadel was louder than Morty remembered, a maze of metal and light, every hallway crowded with voices that all sounded like his own, only pitched slightly higher or lower. Rows of Ricks moved past in their lab coats, carrying equipment, arguing in sharp, quick bursts. Somewhere far above, the station's engines rumbled like a restless stomach. Rick had brought him along for reasons he didn't bother to explain. They were here to trade for something, or steal something, or both. The line was always blurred. Morty followed a few steps behind, trying not to stare at the endless faces that looked like his. They passed a records office tucked between 2 labs. The door stood open, and inside was a wall of thin metal drawers, each labelled with a number and a small square photograph. Rows and rows of Mortys, every face caught mid-blink, mid-smile, mid-scowl. On impulse, Morty stepped inside. The clerk, another Morty, older, with glasses, looked up from a clipboard. "Help you?" "Yeah, just wanted to see mine," Morty said. The clerk set the clipboard down and pulled open a drawer. His fingers moved with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, until they stopped. He frowned, flipped through the files again, then checked the drawer above, then below. Finally he said, "Huh." Morty felt a small, cool knot forming in his stomach. "What?" The clerk leaned back, scratching behind his ear. "You're not here, like, at all. No photo, no ID. It's like you never got assigned a number." "That's weird, right?" Morty asked, though his voice was quiet, almost careful. The other Morty hesitated, then gave a small, tight nod. "Yeah, we keep records of every Morty, even the ones who," he trailed off, glanced toward the door, "even the ones who don't last long." Before Morty could ask more, Rick's voice echoed from the hallway. "Morty, quit socializing with yourself and let's go." Morty stepped back from the counter. The clerk gave him one last look, not unkind, but heavy, like someone staring at a photograph they know will fade, and then returned to his clipboard. Walking away, Morty felt an odd mixture of relief and unease. If the Citadel didn't have him on record, then maybe, in some small way, he was already outside the system, already halfway gone. Rick didn't ask what had taken so long, and Morty didn't tell him. Some things, he thought, were easier to keep between yourself and the empty space that remembered you. They stopped in a cafe that didn't seem to belong to any particular dimension. The sign above the door read, "The place between hunger and fullness." Morty didn't know if that was the real name, or just something his mind had translated for him. The air smelled faintly of bread baking, though no ovens were visible. Rick ordered something complicated in a language that sounded like marbles rolling over glass. Morty just asked for a sandwich. The server, a tall, slow-moving being whose face was all soft folds, nodded and brought him a plate. At first glance it looked ordinary. 2 slices of bread, lettuce, cheese, something pale and thinly sliced. But when Morty took a bite, the taste was missing. Not bad, not bland, just absent, like his mouth had forgotten what flavour was. He chewed again, slower. The textures were there, the faint crunch of lettuce, the pull of the bread's crust. But the moment he tried to name the taste, it slid away. The server came by, tilting their head. "It is a memory sandwich," they said, in a low, even voice. "It is made from something you once had, but no longer can." Morty set it down. "I don't think I remember this." "Then it may not be yours," the server replied gently. "Sometimes they arrive from other versions of you, the ones who had afternoons you did not." Rick, chewing noisily on whatever he'd ordered, didn't seem to hear any of this. Morty tried again, a smaller bite. A flicker came. Him, sitting on a curb somewhere warm, holding half a sandwich and laughing at something someone had said. He couldn't see the person's face, couldn't even tell what was funny. The warmth faded as soon as he noticed it. He finished it anyway, out of politeness or hope, he wasn't sure which. When the plate was cleared, the server left a small slip of paper. No bill, just a single line written in looping script. "You will forget this meal, but it will not forget you." Back on the street, Rick wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Well, that was overpriced," he muttered, already scanning for the next errand. Morty didn't answer. He kept thinking of the missing taste, the laugh without a face, the sandwich that never was, and yet somehow had been. It began in little ways, like the soft tug of a thread at the edge of a sweater. Morty would start a conversation and find himself somewhere else entirely, hours later, unsure of how he had arrived. A sentence left his mouth, and the words lingered behind him, drifting into empty air. A laugh started, and he couldn't quite remember why it had begun. The world itself seemed to breathe differently around him. Hallways curved just slightly more than they should. Doors appeared where there hadn't been doors before, and windows revealed views he didn't recognize but somehow remembered. One afternoon, walking to school, he glanced down an alley that hadn't been there yesterday. He hesitated at the edge, the gravel crunching under his sneakers, and realized he could feel the alley watching him, like it remembered every step he had taken before. He turned and went home anyway. He began noticing that time no longer held him tightly. Minutes would stretch, then collapse. He could feel hours fold back on themselves, like paper origami, leaving him cradled in empty spaces between events. It wasn't frightening. Not exactly. It was gentle. as if the universe was nudging him to let go of the rigid lines that had kept him contained. Summer had started to notice, though she didn't mention it. Sometimes she would ask, "Hey, Morty, did you do that thing earlier?" And he would pause, trying to place the memory. "I think so," he would answer. The pause felt longer than necessary, but nobody seemed impatient. The gaps were theirs too, though they didn't know it yet. Rick, of course, noticed in his own way. He didn't speak of it, just glanced sometimes, a frown shadowing his eyes, and returned to his work. Morty knew that look. It wasn't worry. Not exactly. It was the acknowledgement of something that could not be fixed, only observed. That night, Morty lay in bed and let the day fold around him. He could feel the edges of himself softening, unspooling slowly like a ribbon left in the wind. He thought of the garden, of the jars of forgotten moments, of the sandwich that never existed. Somehow, each small vanishing had been leading him here, to this quiet understanding that presence was not always measured by permanence. He drifted off with the gentle pull of the key in his pocket against his palm, the whisper of the worlds he had begun to collect around himself. Nothing had to be remembered perfectly. Nothing had to remain whole. For now, it was enough that he was still here, even if just for a moment, unfolding quietly into the spaces between moments. Rick worked late into the night, the garage lit only by the soft hum of machinery and the occasional flash of a spark. He didn't speak much, only muttering to himself in that low, rough voice that sometimes sounded like he was talking to the air itself. Morty watched from the doorway, unsure if he should enter or quietly retreat. The project was strange, even by Rick's standards. A collection of wires, metal plates and jars stacked on top of one another, some glowing faintly, others completely dark. He moved between them with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, yet Morty could feel a tension underlying every motion. What is it?" Morty asked, voice small. Rick didn't look up. "A contingency for you." Morty frowned. "For me?" "Yes, Morty, for you. You keep slipping, and the universe doesn't always notice when someone like you vanishes." His voice softened for the briefest moment, but only enough for Morty to catch it. Then it hardened again. "So, I'm making sure you leave something behind, something stable." Morty stepped closer, drawn to the jars. They were filled with tiny bursts of light, moving in patterns like fireflies trapped in slow currents. Are these memories?" Rick shrugged, tightening a screw on one of the metal plates. "Not yours exactly. Not yet. But they will hold traces. If you ever fade completely, something from you can remain." Morty's stomach tightened. He'd begun to realize just how fragile his presence in the world had become, and now Rick was trying to preserve it in some mechanical, glowing form. "You care about me," he said, almost whispering. Rick didn't answer, only adjusted a jar so that the tiny light spun in a gentle orbit. Morty thought he saw something like sadness flicker in Rick's eyes, before it vanished behind the mask of indifference he always wore. They worked together in silence for a while. Morty didn't touch the tools, but he sat nearby, feeling the rhythm of Rick's hands, the soft hum of machines, the warmth of shared quiet. It was a small, fragile comfort in a universe that sometimes forgot him entirely. When the night ended, Rick stepped back and examined his work. The garage smelled faintly of ozone and oil, and the jars glowed softly in the dim light, like captured stars. "It's done, for now," he said. Morty took a deep breath and pressed his hand against the nearest jar. Inside, he thought he saw the faintest outline of himself, smiling, unbroken, remembered in a way the real world had begun to forget. And in that moment, he understood something important. Sometimes being seen wasn't about others. Sometimes it was about the quiet traces you leave behind, the spaces you fill when no one else is looking, and the worlds that remember even when the world itself does not. Morty found it in a shop tucked away between two streets that didn't seem to exist yesterday. The sign above the door read, in gold leaf letters curling like smoke, "Temporal Curiosities." Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and static. Shelves were filled with clocks, some enormous, some tiny enough to fit in the palm of a hand. but the one that caught Morty's eye was different. It didn't tick, at least not in any audible way. Its hands moved, barely perceptible, over a face that seemed to shimmer in and out of focus. The numbers didn't count hours or minutes in the usual sense. They marked moments that had almost been forgotten. "You like it?" The voice startled him. A shopkeeper appeared from behind a stack of clocks. Their eyes held the soft calm of someone who had waited a long time. It measures things slipping away, the seconds that almost vanish before anyone notices. Morty leaned closer. He could feel it, a gentle tug, as though the clock was breathing slowly, pulling at invisible threads in his chest. He thought of the disappearing sandwiches, the alleys that looped, the faint outlines of himself in Rick's jars. Can I keep it?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. The shopkeeper smiled. "You can, but remember, it won't stop time. It just shows you what slips quietly between the cracks, and sometimes that is enough." He walked home with the clock tucked under his arm. The hands moved so slowly it was almost imperceptible, yet each time he looked at it, he could feel the moments that had nearly been forgotten stretching across his consciousness. A laugh from yesterday he hadn't remembered, a glance from summer that lingered just a beat too long, the way Rick had pressed the jar into his hand without explaining why. That night, Morty placed the clock on his nightstand. Its faint shimmer bathed the room in soft, shifting light. He watched as the hands moved in slow, deliberate arcs, noticing moments of himself he hadn't realized existed. The tiny victories, the seconds of kindness, the fleeting pieces of joy that would have slipped entirely if not for the quiet measure of the clock. For the first time in a long while, Morty felt anchored. Not because the world was holding him, but because he was holding the world. And in those tickless ticks, he realized that even vanishing could be beautiful when you remembered enough to see it. Morty discovered it one quiet evening, when the sky had a washed-out shade of purple, and the city seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't a window in the usual sense, no glass, no frame, only the faint shimmer of a rectangle of air that seemed to hum softly when he approached. The edges pulsed, just enough to suggest presence without revealing substance. When he looked through it, the world behind him changed subtly. Streets he had walked 100 times appeared slightly altered. A lamppost taller, a brick missing, a cat pausing longer on a fence. And yet, everything he saw felt familiar, like a memory that had faded just enough to need reminding. A voice came from somewhere close, gentle and calm. "It remembers you, even when you forget it." Morty turned. No one was there. Yet he felt it, the quiet certainty of being noticed by the air itself. He reached out and pressed his hand against the shimmer. The moment it touched his skin, he saw flashes of himself he hadn't consciously remembered. Helping a lost bird from a storm drain, catching a jar of spilled marbles for a neighbour he barely knew, laughing at a joke he didn't even recall. The window didn't just show him these moments, it preserved them, holding them steady in the way the stars hold their light across vast, empty distances. Morty realized that even if the world forgot him, the universe, in its quiet, patient way, would not. He lingered there, pressing his palms against the invisible surface, feeling the pulse of time that was neither fast nor slow, but patient, steady, and unwavering. When he finally pulled back, the edges of the shimmer faded, but the warmth it left inside him remained. Walking home, Morty felt lighter. Perhaps it wasn't about being remembered by everyone, by all the Ricks and Mortys and strangers rushing past. Perhaps it was enough that something, somewhere, kept the trace of him alive, like a window always waiting to open again. That night, as he lay in bed, he could almost hear it breathing, a soft, lullaby rhythm beneath the hum of the universe. And he thought, for the first time in a long while, that maybe being remembered was less about others, and more about noticing yourself in the quiet spaces that already exist. It started quietly, as most extraordinary things do. The sky was a muted grey, the clouds low and heavy, but the drizzle that felt different, lighter, almost deliberate. Each drop seemed to carry a faint hum, a sound that was just beyond words, like the echo of a memory you couldn't fully name. Morty walked through it slowly, letting the rain kiss the edges of his face, his jacket, his hands. And then he noticed something remarkable. Every time a drop hit the pavement, it lingered for a heartbeat, trembling slightly, as if the world itself were holding on to the moment. The whispers started soon after. Not loud, not urgent, merely soft murmurs, gentle as a lullaby. They weren't words Morty could understand at first, more like fragments of thoughts, lost jokes, half-forgotten songs. But gradually he recognized them. Tiny pieces of lives that had slipped away, a greeting someone had never returned, the scent of bread baked and left to cool, a lull in a conversation that had ended too soon. He tilted his head, listening. Each raindrop that landed near him collected these fragments, pooling them into the puddles at his feet. He knelt and watched as the reflections shimmered, glimpses of what had almost been, or might have been, if someone had remembered. Somewhere above, the clouds thickened, but Morty didn't feel fear. The rain was patient, and it carried a strange comfort. He realized that even the moments people forgot were not truly gone. They floated, waiting, shimmering in the spaces between presence and absence, and now he could touch them, if only for a heartbeat. He let the rain fall heavier, letting it soak through his jacket, through his hair. With every step, every splash, he felt more tethered, not to the world that often forgot him, but to the universe that always remembered in its own quiet way. By the time he reached home, he was drenched, chilled, but lighter than he had felt in weeks. That night, lying in bed, he could still hear the soft hum of rain on the roof, carrying with it 1,000 tiny whispers of lives he had never lived but now somehow knew. And somewhere in the hush of the world, Morty felt the gentle truth of it. Even when everything fades, there is always a place for what matters to linger, softly, patiently, quietly waiting to be noticed again. It wasn't on any map, not the city map, not the transit hubs, not even the maps Morty had begun to draw for himself. He stumbled upon it one evening when the sky was the colour of worn denim, the streetlights dim and uncertain. The alley was narrow, just wide enough for a single person, with walls of brick that glowed faintly, as if the mortar itself held a memory. Morty took a step forward, and then another, and before long he realized he was back at the entrance. The air smelled the same. The faint hum of the city outside had vanished. He tried turning, retracing his steps, left, right, zigzagging, always ending up at the same spot. The alley had folded in on itself, or perhaps it had always been a circle and he was only now noticing. He stopped, breathing shallowly, trying to remember the rhythm of the street outside, but there was nothing to remember, nothing but the alley and himself. At first, panic whispered. Then slowly, curiosity replaced it. The alley didn't hurry him. It didn't demand he leave. Instead, it waited, patient and silent, as though inviting him to notice something he had been missing. Morty began speaking aloud, softly, almost in a whisper. "I'm here," he said. "I'm still here." He spoke of the day's rain, of the sandwich that never existed, of the window that remembered him. The alley seemed to respond, walls pulsing faintly, light bending gently around him. And then he laughed, a small, quiet laugh that caught him by surprise. He realized the alley was not trying to trap him. It was trying to show him that he carried himself wherever he went, even when the world forgot. The looping path was a mirror, reflecting every small, overlooked moment of his presence back to him. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time here felt thin, pliable, like soft clay. Morty didn't care. He walked, he paused, he spoke to himself and to the alley. Slowly a door appeared at the far end, faint and unassuming, almost like it had been there all along, waiting for him to notice he had always had a way out. When he stepped through, the alley vanished behind him. The street outside smelled of rain and warm pavement. The city hummed its familiar, imperfect tune, and Morty realized that the alley had done more than test him. It had reminded him that even when spaces loop and time bends, the part of him that mattered, that he noticed and remembered, could always find a way forward. Morty hadn't expected to hear her. It was late, the kind of hour when the city feels smaller, and the air is heavy with quiet. He was wandering near the alleyways he had begun to know as strange and patient, letting the soft hum of the night guide his steps. Then he heard it, a voice so faint he thought it was the wind at first. "Morty." He stopped, holding his breath. The voice was unmistakably hers, yet it didn't come from any direction he could see. It was everywhere and nowhere, filling the spaces between bricks, the gaps in the air. He whispered back, "Summer? Where are you?" The reply was lighter than a sigh, and yet it carried a weight of miles, moments, and memories. "I'm here and there and everywhere you need me." Morty closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. They didn't make literal sense. They weren't meant to. It was the feeling that mattered, that she remembered him, even when no one else did, that she could reach across the invisible folds of the world just to let him know he was not truly alone. He wandered slowly, listening, following the soft cadence of her voice through streets that shifted under his feet. A door would appear here, a shadow there, and every time he thought he had lost the sound, it returned, brushing against his ear like a gentle wind through trees. "Do you know why?" he asked, voice trembling, not from fear but from awe. "Because some things, Morty," she whispered, "don't disappear if you care enough to notice. Some things echo, even when they are quiet. You matter, Morty, even when the world doesn't see." The words wrapped around him, a warmth that settled into his chest. He realized the truth of it, that even as he faded, even as moments slipped away, there was always someone who could reach across the unseen gaps and find him. By the time he returned home, the city had returned to its usual hum. The night felt ordinary, yet Morty carried with him a profound sense of quiet wonder. Summer's whisper was not a sound he could bottle or replay. It was a presence, a tether, a small miracle that reminded him of the beauty in being noticed, if only just enough to be remembered. And that night, as he lay in bed, he let the whisper linger in his thoughts, letting it pull him into sleep like a soft hand guiding him into the dream world. It appeared quietly, without fanfare one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world exhaled a soft amber glow. Morty had wandered to the edge of a canyon he hadn't known existed, a rift between two hills that were familiar yet strange, like the space between a memory and a dream. And there it was, a bridge, delicate and shimmering, stretching across nothing visible but the soft pulse of light beneath. He stepped forward cautiously. The plank seemed to hum faintly, resonating with something deep inside him. He looked over the edge and saw not emptiness, but a vast, folding space that twisted and turned, reflecting parts of himself he didn't always remember. A small voice, not Summer's, not Rick's, but his own, whispered, "This bridge is yours. Only you can cross it." Morty swallowed, feeling the truth in that strange statement. He was alone. Not lonely, but singular. The bridge demanded something quiet, trust, patience, the courage to keep moving forward even when the path felt uncertain. Each step bent the bridge in response to his weight, folding gently, like it had been waiting for him to arrive all along. As he moved, faint lights rose from below, shaping memories and echoes of himself he had forgotten. A laugh, a mistake, a small kindness. They hovered just beneath the surface, shimmering like lanterns in fog. Halfway across he paused. The wind here was alive, carrying tiny whispers of all the places he had visited, the doors he had stepped through, the moments he had almost missed. He realized that the bridge didn't just carry him, it reminded him that he had always carried these fragments of himself, even when he felt lost. At the far end, the light pulsed brighter. Morty stepped onto solid ground again, feeling both relief and an odd sweetness. The bridge hadn't tested him to fail, but to show that he could move forward, even when the way was invisible to anyone else. He turned to look back. The bridge shimmered faintly, then slowly faded into the space between hills. No one would see it except him, and that was enough. The bridge existed not to be remembered by the world, but to remind him of himself. And as Morty walked on, the canyon folding gently behind him, he felt a quiet confidence take root. Some paths were made for others to follow. Some were made for you alone. Morty found it tucked behind a street that hadn't existed yesterday, a narrow alley he had only noticed because the streetlight hummed differently. A heavy wooden door, slightly ajar, invited him in. The sign above read, "Library of Things Almost Forgotten." Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of parchment, dust, and something indefinably sweet, like memories you had never quite had but somehow longed for. Shelves stretched higher than the eye could see, stacked not with books, but with objects. A teacup chipped in one place, a sock with a tiny hole, a watch that ticked backwards, a small jar filled with something that shimmered faintly in the dark. A librarian appeared from the shadows, tall and calm, their hands folded as if holding centuries of patience. "Welcome," they said softly. "Everything here is something someone almost remembered. Some never did. But now, perhaps you will." Morty wandered the aisles slowly, letting his fingers brush against objects. Each one evoked a sensation, a forgotten birthday, a laugh that faded too quickly, the taste of rain on warm asphalt. When he picked up a small music box, it played a lullaby he couldn't name, yet it felt familiar, like a secret thread connecting him to countless unseen versions of himself. The librarian watched him without interrupting, and Morty realized something. This place wasn't about collecting things for the sake of memory. It was about noticing them, holding them gently, letting them exist even when no one else did. He found a small jar at the far end of the room. Inside it contained a tiny flicker, a version of Morty he barely recognized, laughing at something he could no longer recall. He understood that it was a reminder, that even the parts of himself he had forgotten were still there, waiting to be acknowledged. Morty left the jar in his pocket, feeling its faint warmth against his chest. The library had not changed him with grand revelations, only with quiet truths, that forgetting did not mean disappearing, and that the fragments of himself, small and almost invisible, were enough to carry him forward. When he stepped back into the night, the alley and the door were gone, leaving only the soft memory of warmth, a gentle hum in the air, and the sense that the universe had quietly kept a place just for him. Morty stumbled into it on a night that felt heavier than usual, when the sky had a violet hue and the air smelled faintly of ozone and forgotten dreams. The garden was small, yet infinite in the way some places feel when the mind stretches beyond ordinary thought. Each plant glowed like a dying star, soft pulses of light fading and returning, collapsing and reblooming with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. He walked slowly along the winding paths, listening to the quiet hum that seemed to vibrate through his chest. Each star plant was a possibility, a life that could have been, a choice that had bent elsewhere, a moment that almost existed. Some flickered quickly, barely noticed, while others burned steadily, holding on to themselves with quiet determination. A soft voice whispered from somewhere, carrying the calm certainty of a lullaby. These are the lives that might have been, the decisions that almost happened, the words that almost left mouths. They are safe here. They are remembered. Morty knelt beside a faintly glowing bud. As he touched it, he felt the warmth of a moment that was not his own, a memory of laughter he never had, of someone thanking him for a kindness he had not realized he performed. It shimmered gently in his palm before returning to the garden, and Morty understood that it didn't belong to him, yet it did. He wandered deeper, letting the soft light guide him. With every step, the garden seemed to fold around him, the stars collapsing and reblooming in patterns that mirrored his own small internal shifts. Here, nothing rushed him. Nothing demanded that he understand it fully. All that mattered was noticing, honoring, and gently moving along. When Morty finally left the garden, stepping back into the ordinary streets of his world, he carried a subtle warmth in his chest, a feeling that the universe had given him a small gift, the knowledge that even what collapses can leave behind a glow, a trace, a quiet reminder that existence in all its tiny forms was never truly lost. And as he walked home, the city lights seemed softer, the air quieter, and he felt the faint pulse of the garden lingering, like a heartbeat tucked gently into the folds of his mind. Morty found the door unexpectedly. It wasn't in any corridor he had walked before, nor did it appear on any map he had sketched. The knob was warm under his fingers, and when he turned it, the air that greeted him smelled like dusk, like soft blankets, like the moments right before waking. Inside, the room was small and circular, lined with shelves that shimmered faintly. They were filled with glass orbs, each glowing with a light as soft as candle flame. Morty realized they were not ordinary lights. They flickered like the edge of sleep, pulsing gently with the rhythm of distant memories. A voice, smooth and patient, drifted from somewhere unseen. These are the dreams Mortis have almost remembered, the ones that slipped away before they could be caught. Each holds a fragment of possibility, a shadow of hope, a sigh of longing. Morty walked slowly, reaching for a small orb. It trembled under his touch and revealed a brief vision, himself laughing on a clouded afternoon, talking to someone he could not quite see, a fleeting joy that had never settled into reality. He felt it in his chest, a warmth that lingered, then returned to the orb, which glowed softly in acknowledgement. He picked another and another. Each dream was different, a whispered promise, a day spent differently, a fear overcome that had never happened. Morty understood that the room did not belong to him alone. It belonged to all Mortys, every version that existed, every fragment that had almost touched the world. Sitting on the floor, he let the orbs settle around him, their gentle pulses like the quiet heartbeat of a universe that remembered even the faintest echoes. He realized the dreams were not meant to be reclaimed, only to be noticed, held gently, and released again. When he finally stood and stepped back through the door, the world outside seemed softer, quieter, as though the room had left a gentle residue behind. Morty walked home, carrying with him the awareness that even the dreams we cannot fully remember still matter. They linger, quietly, in spaces only the heart can see, waiting to remind us of the beauty of the almost, the nearly and the unseen. Morty wandered through a hallway that appeared out of nowhere, its walls smooth and softly glowing. The air was quiet, almost impossibly so, except for the faint resonance of voices that never formed words. It was a place where conversations existed without sound, a corridor of thoughts and feelings caught between moments. As he walked, the walls shifted slightly, revealing whispers of past selves, fragments of Morty's choices that had never fully manifested. A younger Morty hesitated at a doorway he had once ignored. An older one reached for something he never touched. Each presence glimmered faintly, a soft pulse of recognition that seemed to say, "I see you, even when you don't see me." Morty realized he could feel them, not through hearing, but through the quiet thrum of shared memory and emotion. Fear, wonder, curiosity, regret, all these pulses intertwined around him like threads of light. He sensed the corridor was teaching him a subtle truth, the unspoken, the unnoticed, the almost forgotten. These were as real as anything tangible. He paused and closed his eyes. A wave of silent conversations washed over him, apologies he had never made, gratitude he had never spoken, encouragement he had never given. And yet they existed here, echoing softly, waiting to be acknowledged. Morty understood that these echoes did not need words to matter. Their presence alone was enough. Moving forward, he left small impressions of himself on the walls. A laugh that almost was, a thought that had nearly been shared, a hope that had faded too quickly. The corridor responded with a gentle glow, folding these fragments into its endless path. When Morty finally emerged at the corridor's end, the world outside seemed quieter in a new way, richer with the understanding that even the things left unsaid can leave a mark. And as he walked on, he carried the soft echo of those silent conversations, a reminder that every version of himself mattered, even the ones who had almost been forgotten. Morty stumbled into the garden on a morning that felt neither quite day nor quite night, the sky a gentle wash of lavender and silver. He hadn't walked this path before, yet it seemed familiar, like the echo of a dream he had once almost had. The garden was alive in a quiet, deliberate way. Flowers glowed faintly at the edges of their petals. Leaves shimmered with the memory of wind, and the air carried a soft scent of rain and warmth. Every step Morty took seemed to stir whispers of the past, moments of kindness, laughter, small victories, and gentle regrets, each one leaving a faint trace in the soil beneath him. A voice drifted from the foliage, soft and calm, almost like a lullaby. "This is a place that remembers you. Even when the world forgets, even when you do, we hold the traces of who you are." Morty knelt and touched a glowing bloom. It pulsed gently beneath his fingers, and he felt a warmth that carried memories he had nearly let slip away. The taste of a sandwich he had never finished, a quiet word from summer, the soft hum of Rick's garage at night. Each pulse reminded him that existence was not measured only by permanence, but by the small living impressions left behind. He wandered further, feeling the garden fold around him. Tiny paths opened to hidden alcoves, each holding something he had almost forgotten. A laugh, a glance, a fleeting thought. Morty understood that the garden was not only a place to revisit memory, but a place to honor it, to notice it, to let it breathe. When he finally rose to leave, the garden shimmered softly, as if bowing in farewell. Morty stepped back into the ordinary streets, carrying with him the subtle glow of 1,000 small moments. Even if the world outside moved on, the garden had preserved him, quietly, patiently, lovingly. And that night, as he lay in bed, he felt the pulse of that memory in his chest, a gentle heartbeat that reminded him, being remembered is not always about others. Sometimes it is about noticing yourself and letting yourself be seen, even by the world's quietest witnesses. The night came gently, like a breath held for a long moment. Morty walked through streets softened by quiet shadows, feeling the weight of countless invisible threads stretching across time and space. Each step carried him not forward, but deeper into a world that existed between what was remembered and what was nearly forgotten. Above him, stars trembled softly, folding into the night like scattered pieces of light, settling into a pattern he couldn't yet name. The wind whispered faintly, carrying fragments of conversations, laughs and sighs, echoes from himself, from others, from versions of a world he had barely touched. He came to a small park, a place that seemed ordinary, yet it hummed with the gentle insistence of all that had been and all that might be. The grass glowed faintly beneath his feet, and the trees swayed as though acknowledging his presence. Morty realized that the night itself was remembering him, every choice, every quiet act, every fleeting thought, and folding it gently into the light. He lay down on the soft grass, staring upward. Each star reflected a fragment of the day, the rain that collected whispers, the alley that looped, the bridge only he could cross, the library of almost forgotten things, and the garden that remembered him. They folded into one another in a pattern both strange and comforting, a mosaic of moments that had been preserved, not by grand events, but by gentle noticing. A soft warmth rose through him, a calm realization. The universe did not forget, even when he did, every fleeting act of care, every small pulse of courage, every whisper of love or laughter had been quietly collected, stored, and folded into the light that surrounded him now. As Morty closed his eyes, he felt a gentle exhale ripple through the night, a sigh of contentment that seemed to say, "It is enough. It has always been enough." And somewhere, the world shimmered softly, bending time and memory into one quiet moment of peace, carrying him gently into sleep, letting every pulse of light remind him he mattered. Morning arrived quietly, as if it had been waiting for him. The light seeped softly through the windows, brushing walls, floors, and even the edges of shadows with a calm amber glow. Morty stirred, feeling the echo of the night still lingering in his chest, the night that folded into light, the stars that held fragments of him, the garden, the corridors, the rain. He rose slowly, noticing the small details, the hum of the city outside, the faint warmth of a cup of coffee Rick had left unattended, the gentle tilt of a plant in the sunlight. Every little thing seemed to remember him, as if the world itself had folded a memory around him while he slept. He stepped outside, letting the soft warmth of the morning wash over him. The streets, the alleyways, even the folds of the sidewalks held traces of the journeys he had taken, the whispers he had heard, the bridges he had crossed. Morty realized that even when moments faded from immediate memory, they left traces that the universe never truly lost. For a while, he simply walked, feeling the quiet rhythm of existence settle into his bones. The sun rose higher, yet it did not hurry, and he did not need to either. Everything he had seen, touched, or remembered seemed to pulse gently beneath the surface, a quiet reassurance. Presence matters, even when subtle, fleeting, or almost invisible. And somewhere in that soft morning, Morty understood the simplest truth, that life was not always about being seen, or being remembered by everyone, or making grand gestures. Sometimes it was about noticing yourself, honouring the small pulses of kindness and courage, and letting the world, in its own gentle way, remember you. He sat on a bench, closed his eyes, and breathed slowly. Somewhere nearby, birds murmured their morning songs, leaves whispered in the breeze, and the city hummed a gentle lullaby. And in the soft glow of the day, he felt complete, not because of everything he had done, but because of everything he had noticed, held, and allowed to exist.